Before them lay a great plateau of orange stone. The sun rose high above them, now leaning to the west. Beneath it, like the great columns of an ancient temple, rose two spires of stone, smoothed by eons of abuse from the raging winds. Their weathered forms might have been great sculptures of men in ages past, now twin sentinels against the west. Below the spires, across the flatlands, were patches of green and blue. Small ponds watered from the ever-present mists lay there, surrounded by low-hanging grasses and shrubs, dotted with reds and pinks. To the east, rising again like the bluff itself, were the trees. The trees of Sunauchi had been a sight to behold, arboreal colossi rising in beautiful twisting forms from the earth below. These, however, rose like fence posts or a colonnade, stretching from the earth below in perfect vertical pursuit, terminating in a canopy of deep green clouds at their zenith. The paths grew smaller now and began to branch. Structures like hollowed-out gourds began to appear, suspended from the branches above. Circular windows were set into each, and subtle green light issued forth from their entrances. Dozens of these structures hung above and below, and dozens more could be seen as they continued their trek through the trees. The path dipped before them, two sturdy supports holding aloft a floating platform. Below, a sphere of immense size hung, suspended by a dozen or more ropes. Below again, Nell perceived that a branch held its weight, but no other limbs could be seen below the canopy above. The path led to the middle of the sphere, about its top. Tapestries of browns and greens laid across its circular form, adorned with bone and semi-precious stones. Winding their way to the structure, a ladder could be seen extending within the sphere, piercing its zenith. Welcome to the world building session. In my world, I have two sets of forest dwellers. Both are of the same species, a race that I have basically just always called sprites. I don't know when I first ran into that word. I know that it is not a particularly uncommon term in fantasy literature. It seems like it generally has to do with almost a fairy-like creature. Mine are much more like my own solution for elves. I wanted to have elves in my world, but I wanted to have them be different. I wanted them not to be like the Tolkienian elves. As much as I really enjoy Tolkien, I wanted to do my own thing. Largely, that's how I set out to do just about everything, though I don't think it's necessary. And if you're just getting started on world building, I would rely on some of the old tropes. There's nothing wrong with using elves and orcs and dwarves and things like that. I just wanted to do my own thing. And because this has been a project I've been working on for 20 years, it has not been a bad decision, but I wouldn't encourage everyone to take that same leap. But for me, both of these groups of sprites live in very different kinds of forests. The sprites that live in this forest are the sprites of Hyoku. In an earlier age, I called them light and dark sprites, which, as you might imagine, is kind of fraught with a lot of potential racist stuff from our own world, and so I didn't really want to include that. I will probably eventually, if I haven't already and just have forgotten, will create an in-world term for these two races being, ever so slightly distinct. Their fur and such, their coats, have been distinct as I've been writing, but they're not really like light and dark so much. They more just have different tendencies in how they do things, and certain colors tend to show up a little bit more in one group versus the other. The biggest difference is there was a cultural schism, and the sprites that lived in the big forest of Sunauchi, which is kind of a jungle, ended up moving to this forest, to Hyoku. And this is a gigantic forest, as you can kind of see here in this little sketch. It's a forest on top of a massive bluff, like a mesa. And the trees there are really, really tall, and they're probably like akin to our cypress trees. That's kind of what I'm envisioning, where they are resinous and evergreen, but not quite like your general spruce or cedar or something like that. Something a little bit more interesting and unique. But they dwell very high off the forest floor because there's really creepy, terrible things that live in the super dense, really, really dark underbelly of that forest. And so their life is suspended primarily in the canopy. And the sprites of Tsunauchi are in this jungle. So they live all the way from the forest floor all the way up to the top of the canopy. And they don't believe in cutting anything. So they grow all the plants into the structures that they want to use. And the sprites in Hyoku, who have had a much harder life essentially, have basically come to the conclusion that they're going to have to harm some of the plants in order to build the structures that they need to survive. And they've kind of come to a good place with the trees where they can actually communicate with them. And so I was just writing this the other day, and the way that I kind of wrote it was a lot of the trees almost give up a tithe of their branches each year. So it's almost something that the sprites have worked out as an agreement with the trees. Like, we will tend you, we will keep you safe, we will make sure you're fertilized, whatever the trees need that the sprites could provide. And then in turn, the trees offer up a small portion of their wood, of their flesh, each year. And these kind of cultural things are a little bit intriguing as the two groups are beginning to integrate a little bit right now due to some pretty awful tragedies that happened to Tsunauchi's forest. And so the cultures are trying to find a way to get along and kind of to merge, but it's going to be a little rocky. They've been separated for thousands of years. But I guess the whole point of this entire thing is just to talk about the fact that these are forest dwellings. And so what I'm working on today is not just homes or dwellings specifically, which I've talked about before, but forest dwellings. And they have a lot of those same things to kind of think about that you would run into if you were working on a house in, any realm. So a lot of the same things that I've talked about, building materials, techniques and technology that is known to those people, where their food comes from, the kinds of structures that they would actually need, because it's not like every civilization needs the same things. If you're living in the treetops, you probably don't need fortresses and castles. But it's also kind of fun to think about, like, what would that look like if they did want to build something that was akin to a fortress or a castle? What would that look like in this particular scenario? So those kinds of things are always good to play with. But I would love to hear from you as we kind of get started here. If you have any groups of people, any societies or civilizations in your fiction world that you're working on that live in forests, I'd love to hear about them. And if you wouldn't mind sharing that in the comments below, that'd be wonderful. The sprites have been fun for me because they're, again, kind of like elves. They're a little bit druidic, a little hippie-ish in a good way, but also they are distinct. They have 6 fingers on each of their hands and 6 toes on each of their feet, and the extra ones are actually extra thumbs, and so they're exceedingly agile, and they're shorter than the humans. Very, very heavy. They have dense bone structures, heavy for their size at least. It wouldn't be like ludicrously heavy, but they're kind of a mix there of dwarves and elves. They're shorter, they're smaller, and there's some prejudice there that comes against them, but also they are incredibly agile, and it's been fun to work with them. Their language is melodic, so it's really, really hard for other people to learn because much of what they do is sing things rather than talk about them and say them. And so it's been kind of interesting too to write the characters, because the characters are, often struggling with English, which is of course not English, but it's the, I'm writing in English, so that's what we got to deal with. But it's like they struggle with the common speech because the cadence is so different than what they would generally be working with, because everything would be melodic, and the timing and the way things were delivered would be different. I ran into this a little bit when I was teaching English in China for a time, which was only like a week or two, but it was this cool thing that I got to do when I was in college. And so much of what is conveyed in Chinese seems to be communicated via tone. And as an English speaker, an American English speaker, I really struggled to hear any of it. And it feels very odd and alienating in a way to have somebody say a word to you, you say it back, and they're like, "No, that wasn't the same. That wasn't the same." And you're like, "Okay, but like phonetically to me, that sounded exactly the same." Our ears are just not primed to hear those things. And so the same is kind of true for the sprites. Like their ears are not primed to hear the same thing that ours are. And there are very few humans and other mortals who are capable of speaking the sprite tongue because it has all these other elements to it. But in designing their structures, their dwellings, even just their lifestyle among the trees, a lot of questions have come up. And one that came up just the other day while I was writing and actually thinking about this session is food. Because how in the world do you farm things when you live in the treetops? And I don't know why this is something I never really thought about, but it's something that eluded me. So immediately I started thinking about how would this be handled. And I haven't solved it. In fact, I've only had about a day or two to think about it, but it's immediately exciting to me. I love these kinds of problem-solving things. And so I was trying to think about, well, I wonder if they could literally build gardens on like the tops of some of these platforms. Like it would have to be either on the edges of the forest or it would have to be at the peak of the canopy. But I was thinking like, what kind of things could they build? And as long as there's enough sunlight, you could actually grow a lot of things. Obviously, they would have to go down to the base of the forest and harvest soil, but then you can build in all kinds of fun stuff with that, where there's like rituals about having to get soil, and maybe that's a coming of age thing. You know, instead of going out into the fields and killing your lion or whatever, it's going to the root of the forest and hauling up X amount of soil. And maybe that's something they have to do once a month in expeditions. Maybe they use a lot of their own not manure, but like their own sewage as fertilizer for those gardens, which again, like grosses humans out, but it's, you know, we use fertilizer from other animals. We use other animals' manure for crops, and the term humanure is actually a thing. Like there are some studies that suggest that that might be a really good thing. I've even heard it, though I don't know if this is true or not, that a human produces the amount of waste necessary to grow the food that they would need for a year. Now, again, I don't know if that's true, but it seems almost logical in its own way and would be really cool. It would be really cool if that's the case. So I'm just trying to think about these gardens right now and how these gardens might occur. Like, could you have, you know, some kind of platforms that rested upon the branches wherein you had, you know, maybe we'll start with just the idea of a bunch of pots that each have things growing in them. And, you know, that wouldn't be ridiculous, right? So you think about maybe these are like bean plants and they have their pods growing on them. And they're just pots that are in the trees, either that are at the top of the canopy or trees that are right, you know, the branches that are right up the edge. But it seems like that might work. I don't think that would be quite the most efficient way to do it. I think trellises would probably be really efficient, and that might be kind of the way things go. And you could probably even have like little trees. Like that'd be kind of cool to like grow trees on top of trees, right? So you could have like olives and oranges and other citrus fruits and things like that up at the tops of these trees. It seems like it would be really cool. I'm gonna have to spend a bit of time trying to figure out what that looks like, because that's certainly going to involve some amount of research, which is great because that's one of my favorite parts about doing world building in general, is that it forces you to look things up and learn new things. And that's one of the most wonderful parts about writing and world building and drawing in general, is that you learn new things. I've often thought that one of the best parts about doing something like Inktober is that inevitably you end up drawing things that you wouldn't otherwise, which forces you to learn how to do things that you wouldn't invest time into. And I think that's good for us as artists. So, yeah, It will be fun to go look up like some strategies, because there's got to be like some terracing techniques that I can take and modify from some of those steps in Asia. And there's just got to be a lot of things like that I can work with. I'm also going to have to try to figure out like what are some good shorthand ways to draw these things, because some plants, without, I guess color would probably be the solution here, right? Just grab a bunch of greens and start going ham on things, but maybe I'll do that in a little bit. I kind of like the idea of something like this, though. I don't know, like, really how practical it is, but you don't have to nail it with every idea for the first time. But this kind of comes to, one of those big points with designing any kind of dwelling is you have to think about, and this isn't just like homes, literally, like this can be a city, this can be a civilization. And it's one of the most important things to consider when you're world building is what do they do for food? And yeah, I'm kind of food obsessed, but at the end of the day, like food accessibility is maybe the number one thing after water accessibility for if a people group can survive in an area. And I mean, water is obviously the most important, but once water's handled, like food has to be the next thing, because if you have water, you can you can transport food from one region to another and eat off of it. But generally, that food has to come from somewhere pretty close by, otherwise it's going to be exceedingly expensive. So this is a really important thing to think of. I can't believe I didn't think about it in the past, but maybe when I was younger, I thought they were going to hunt the beasts and creatures that are roaming at the bottom of the forest, but they are kind of pseudo-vegetarian. That's kind of the way that it's gone in my brain as I've continued to develop them and the way they work with things. I don't know if that will stay. That feels very stereotypical to me, but again, that's kind of the way I've written it, because it creates a distinction between the sprites in our story and the other sprites. And also, the sprite that was in the first book was pretty hardcore vegetarian, and then another sprite ends up traveling with the group later on, and she's not a vegetarian. And they're like, oh, I just thought sprites were vegetarian. And she's like, oh, what? Because like one sprite you ran into was, like, now you think all of us are? And, which is kind of comical, because that is often how we think about things, whether it's right or wrong. These are actually some quick sketches of the sprites. I haven't nailed down a design I particularly like yet. I feel like this is probably closest, but I'm not positive. I gotta work on them a little bit more. Character design stuff is stressful for me. And this is the most recent iterations of the trees in Hyoku. I've done some studying. This is from looking at the Pacific Northwest and kind of how the trees work there. You can see like there's really interesting stuff going on here, and almost looks like little trees growing off the side. I didn't know this occurred, but in my studying I found that, and it was really cool. And here you can actually see like some tiny little dwellings and different rises and platforms and things. This has been really fun to play with and to think about how those things come together. The environment also has a lot of really strong effects on things. And I think in particular, when you're considering the environment being like the tops of trees, that's obviously going to have some pretty strong effects on the way these people are living. And that's a really important thing to consider, whether you're working on forest dwellings or any other kind of dwelling, is thinking about how the environment really impacts your people. I've been having to consider a lot of stuff in the last couple of chapters and through this world building of not just the food, but like how do they get to the tops of the trees? How would you build platforms that would actually hold weight? And what kind of materials would you have access to? When you live in this kind of place, like you're probably not quarrying things. So what would you have in terms of stones? Obviously in our world, when things like this have happened, it's usually inspired trade, which leads me to, okay, well, what do these people have that they could trade? If the trees are pseudo-sacred, there's a good chance they're probably not willing to trade the wood of the trees, but maybe they're willing to do just really small amounts of it, and maybe that makes it really, really precious. Maybe there's something special about it. The trees that they hold as sacred are the rain trees, and those are the ones that actually hold a portion of their souls. Each time a sprite is born, they have a seed or a plant that is attached to them in some way at the soul level, and it becomes linked to them. And so obviously those kinds of trees are not going to be ones that they're going to be able to, even if they were willing, to part with. Sorry, I'm testing some greens here, trying to get the one that works best for what I'm doing. Not really finding it, but that's okay. Sometimes the caps for these things are accurate, and sometimes they really aren't. So let me come back up to this guy. But those kinds of things trouble me sometimes because they can be really important. All of the materials and things that they have access to determine the clothing that they have, determine the decorations that they have, determine how they build their structures, determine what they value, what might be given in, reward for some task completed, what might be the gift for proposal of marriage, what might be the gift for a housewarming or home warming. These kinds of things are dictated on value structures. And if you look at our world, if you look at your own individual culture, likely the things that are given in those situations are things that are rare or scarce, because that is what gives them their value. So I've thought about their garb, and obviously a lot of their clothing is going to come from plants, but there probably is some that comes from the creatures down below, which means, of course, I have to try to think about, well, do they go down and hunt those creatures, or is that something that, they scavenge? I don't really mind either way. Like, the nice part about world building and writing is that you're in charge, and so you can modify things as you need to. I think it can sometimes be tempting to stick to your guns and try to be like, nope, this is what I'm doing and this is how I'm doing it. And I think there probably is some virtue to that. But also, don't be afraid to change your ideas and modify your ideas if you think of better things, or if you find holes in what you were doing. There's no shame in making changes and adjustments. That's just part of the process. It's part of being human. And I think that you will probably grow along with your story and as you tell your story, because stories are alive in a lot of ways. Tolkien, famously continued to mess with his books until the day he died. And I don't think he was ever totally happy with them. He was always tinkering. And I think there's something cool and beautiful about that. At some point, you put it out in the world, you publish it if you're going to go that route, and, it is what it is. But I think that if I ever get the opportunity to publish my books, I will be hard set to it to make sure that things are as accurate as they can be, because I really would hate to have to retcon anything. I would want to just have it be what it is when it comes out, and then give me still the ability to add things in later. Because I think probably once the world is out of your hands and lots of people can see it, then they're gonna find inconsistencies, and you're gonna sit there and beat yourself up about it. But that's okay. Especially for most of us, the absolute vast majority of us, the inconsistencies are just not going to be that important, because chances are nobody's ever going to see these things. They're probably being done for you, probably doing it for yourself, because, why wouldn't you? It's a lovely, fun, enjoyable thing to do. And you probably don't have to worry about it. If you're doing a campaign of some kind for Dungeons and Dragons, maybe, then, if you have pretty bad inconsistencies, your players might notice. But as long as you're DMing fine, they probably won't care. But if you're writing a book or putting a world together for a video game or a story, then having things be consistent is pretty important. And those consistencies are things that gnaw on me, especially since I've been working on these for so long. I know I've spoken about it before, but you might notice the fact that I've got 4 trees on this page. I didn't draw one tree and go, all right, cool, that's it, that's the tree. And that's because I firmly believe that you will uncover better ways of drawing what it is that you're trying to create by doing different forms of it, by iterating. Iterating is an incredibly important part of the process for concept art, for world building, and for most design in general. It gives you the ability to try something out and then to come back to it later and modify it to make a different version, to be of a mindset that allows you to constantly evaluate. And that's really, really strategically important. But another kind of underrated aspect of that way of approaching art, of iterating constantly on new things, is that it often helps you be less precious with each thing, in a way that, like, you're fine trying something new. You're not so married to whatever it is that you built. And on the other side, you don't have any problem modifying things, because that was just one iteration. That was one attempt. And each attempt is just hoping to discover one new thing, one new aspect, one new part of whatever it is that you're creating. Like, on one hand, it would be lovely to just like knock it out of the park and get your design right the first time. And even in situations where I'm really happy with my first draft, I will always, pretty much always, go back and do more versions of it. Because there's just no downside except for the time expenditure. Think about it this way, like, if you knock it out of the park with your first drawing, your first iteration of a dragon or a spaceship or something, and then you do another after it, and you don't like that one as much, like, you wasted a little bit of time, but now you have an even more firm understanding of how much you appreciate that first drawing, that first design. And that's encouraging, because sometimes it's hard to get out of your own head and really understand if your idea is working or not. So doing another version of it gives you the ability to be like, no, that first version really was good. And then the other side of that is, let's say that you like your second version more. Well, congratulations. You now have a better product than you did a moment ago. And of course, that has no downside. That's just wonderful. And so, encouraging. So there's really no downside except for the time expenditure. And it is also like, maybe there's a little bit of anxiety there, because if you do something well, or if you struggle with the idea of doing a drawing that you're not happy with and then feeling like a failure. But if you have those feelings as an artist, first of all, it's super normal. You are not alone. That's pretty much most artists. Second of all, one of the chief jobs of an artist and most difficult tasks is figuring out how to work around that. Because you don't want that feeling to keep you from making things. You have to find a way to move past that so that you can keep engaging in the stuff that you want to engage in. And iterating on concept art and on world building stuff can be a wonderful way to start doing that, to start finding a strategy to move past that, that harshness. It's easy to be harsh and hard on yourself, but it's not particularly productive, especially in art, because art's already fairly psychologically daunting. So it's really important to find strategies to be encouraging to yourself, to help support yourself so you can keep moving forward. I've talked before about artist self-care on this channel, and I think it's really important. But probably the thing that I come back to the most on this channel in this train of thought is be gracious with yourself. Like, you need grace as an artist. And most of the time, that grace has to come from yourself. You need to be gracious with yourself about the process. Art takes a long time. And I think that there's a beauty in that. And yes, that could be just trying to cope with the fact that it's daunting and it takes forever, but oh well. Like, there are certainly worse things. There are worse ways of dealing with stuff than just finding a way to enjoy the mundane. And so I would encourage you to do that. Encourage you to find a way to enjoy the mundane aspects of art, because there's a lot of them, and you're going to spend a lot of time there, especially if you're world building, especially if you want to do big, large scale things. So find a way to enjoy those pieces. Iterate, allow yourself to try several different versions of a thing. Don't be harsh on yourself. See each one as an excuse to learn something new about whatever subject it is that you're working with. Because the reality is, even if that first drawing worked out really well, there's probably a dozen other solutions that would also work. And maybe one of those would work better for you and you would enjoy it more. Maybe one of them's just easier to execute. Sometimes it's as simple as that, is that there's an easier way to draw a thing. And if you're going to be drawing a comic or a world where you're going to have to be drawing the same thing a bunch of times, it can often be good to find an easier way to do things. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up here. I suppose I rambled a little bit more than I expected. I was intending to talk mostly about these tree dwellings, but instead I talked about the people and a lot of other things. I hope you enjoyed the little excerpt from the books at the beginning too. It's fun to share those kind of things. And though it's a little bit vulnerable, but I don't mind it too much. And people are usually pretty kind. But as always, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. Let me know in the comments what you want me to touch on next. And I would be happy to do kind of a Q&A thing if that would be something people would be interested in. Thanks to my patrons as well who are on the screen. If you want to check out my Patreon, you can do so in the description down below. And the Discord is also down there. We're going to be starting on Smogist, and then later in a couple months, I guess we'll be working on Inktober. So it's going to be a good time to engage with those things soon. All right. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.